evening. My name's David Hall, and as a Brilsey trustee, I'm delighted to welcome you to Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, which is celebrating its bicentenary this year. So now it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Timothy Moore. He's a lecturer at the University of Oxford, and his work focuses on the literature and culture of the 18th and 19th centuries and on inclusive histories. His latest solo exhibition, which is Mansfield Park Courting Controversy, involves an inclusive and colonial reappraisal of Jane Austen and remains open at Jane Austen's House Museum in Chawton. It's on till September. And if you can't make it there, you can see an online version at the Jane Austen House website. However, in case you think you're at the wrong talk, Tim is also project curator at the National Trust's Assembly Rooms here in Bath. And tonight he's going to tell us about the ups and downs of the building over the past 250 years. I'll say no more about that because that's Tim's job. So welcome, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's really lovely to see you all here and some familiar faces, which is really lovely. I'll try and make a switch between looking at the camera and looking at the audience as best as I can. But mostly I just want to say it's a real pleasure kind of being at the Bath Assembly Rooms and being such a close neighbour of here at Brilsey, and not just a neighbour, but also a big supporter of all you do here. So on behalf of myself and the wider team at the National Trust, we're very happy to kind of be here to celebrate the bicentenary here at Brilsey. And one of the things I guess you've been thinking about during the bicentenary is the way that the city's changed during the last 200 years. And that's very much going to be a topic that I'm going to talk about a lot today in terms of the Bath Assembly Rooms. And one of the briefs that I was given was to talk a little bit about the ways in which the rooms have survived over the years, so many different challenges. And the way I've interpreted that brief is to go through some of those challenges, not just physical challenges like fire damage or bomb damage, but also financial challenges and also ideological challenges. The Bath Assembly Rooms was a building that was built for a very specific reason and with a very specific vision. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges involved in straying a little bit from that vision over the years and how we're now kind of almost getting back towards the original raison d'etre of the Assembly Rooms and how the National Trust plan to kind of forward that idea and kind of bring the idea of 21st century assembly back to the Assembly Rooms. So that's the kind of broad remit of my talk. There's there's four different periods of challenge that I'd like to talk about in particular. A lot of our biggest challenges were just opening the building to begin with and those teething challenges. So I'll dwell a little bit on that. For a lot of the talk, I'll talk about the period between 1815 and 1942. So that's a huge period. But that was a time of real financial challenge for the Assembly Rooms, and it kind of coincides with the slight decline of the city in terms of it being after the real Georgian heyday. And I'll talk about the way in which the Bath Assembly Rooms both was affected by that slight decline and maybe also fed into it a little bit. So that's going to be one theme of my talk as well. I'll spend a little bit of time on the Second World War. As many of you know, we were hit directly by an incendiary bomb in the Second World War in 1942. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that. I think that's a pretty big challenge that we faced. And lastly, I'll just look at the period between the Second World War and now, and some of the challenges we're experiencing and trying to anticipate and also kind of bring solutions forward. Now we're back in the building and opening it to visitors. Okay, and the last thing I'll say is just a note about methodology. It's a very warm day. We're already a bit sticky, so I'm going to try and make this as brief a talk as possible. It's not going to be a very formal talk. It's not going to be very formulaic. I'm just going to bombard you with a series of images on my slides, and I'm just going to chat through those in a really informal, friendly way. Hopefully that'll encourage lots of questions, but hopefully it'll also mean we can get through at quite a quick pace and we don't have to kind of sit and stew in the heat any longer than we need to. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Can I just check everyone can hear me okay? I'm standing close enough to the mic. Perfect. So let's start with the early challenges. So the Bath Assembly Room, as I mentioned, was the brainchild of John Wood the Elder. And I don't need to tell you how important John Wood the Elder was, considering the location that we're sitting in right now. So he was one of the master architects of Bath. He was responsible for Queen Square and the Circus. Prior Park is up there, although I admit it's a bit of a misleading image actually, because he wasn't responsible for the famous bridge, but Prior Park was his. Um, and even though John Wood the Younger was the one who built the assembly rooms, the idea was John Wood the Elder's. And that was because Bath at this time was really growing. It was a burgeoning city. It was growing very fast, and it was attracting a very diverse crowd in a way that it hadn't done before. And as John Wood was contributing towards the expansion of the city, he was seeing lots of new kinds of people frequenting the streets and frequenting the venues and events that he'd never seen before. And he loved that. He loved the different kinds of conversations that we're having, the kind of increased diversity of the city. And that's where his idea for a different kind of assembly rooms first came from. He said that rank began to be laid aside and all degrees of people united in society with one another. But he looked at the two current assembly rooms in the city, and he noticed that some people would go to both assembly rooms for different events, but some people would only go to one or the other, depending on which people they knew, which social networks they were part of. And he noticed the opportunity for a slight amount of exclusivity there. His vision was to build a new kind of assembly rooms that was big enough to house all kinds of people, so that people didn't have to meet in the streets or on the terrace walks, but they could meet in one assembly room, and they wouldn't need a special kind of social network. They wouldn't need the right kind of invitations or the right kind of introductions. Anyone who could buy a ticket could come to the assemblies. That was his vision. So he said that although rank had begun to be laid aside, he wanted to build a big venue for that. He said a bigger, more capacious and convenient structure for people to assemble is highly necessary. Such a house I have for many years back had a view of building. And this is the purpose. This is the raison d'etre of the assembly rooms. This is how the idea was born. And this is the kind of topic that I'll come back to again and again in this talk, because this, I think, is actually the most important feature of the assembly rooms. And its success or failure in maintaining this vision directly relates to how popular the assembly rooms were during its kind of different eras of time, and how financially viable it was as an institution. The remit is challenges, and one of the biggest challenges they were experienced was the gap between John Wood the Elder's vision and the actual construction of the building today. So John Wood the Younger first tried to realize his father's dream in 1764. You can see that in November on the left of the screen. At the top, he opens a subscription for a new kind of assembly room. So a large building at the northwest corner of Queen Square in this city. So I said earlier that the assembly rooms are near neighbours of you here at Brilsey, and we would have been direct neighbours if this scheme went ahead. So this would have been the view from the front doors, a kind of diagonal view into the square. And this scheme was very popular. So John Wood invited an invitation for financial investors. By May the next year, so not even half a year later, the subscription was full. There were enough people. This was in 1765, but this period of land by the square was in a very new and fashionable part of town at that time. It was very valuable, and this piece of land was embroiled in a very long and protracted inheritance conflict. So long that it actually dragged on for more than 3 years, and John Wood eventually actually gave up on this scheme and had to begin afresh. And I'm very glad that he's a very dogged and persistent kind of character, because I think I know some of the ins and outs of this process. I'm kind of skipping over some of the complexities, but it was a tough time, and we very nearly wouldn't have existed if he wasn't such a persistent person. So a second subscription was opened in 1768. Again, it was opened in November, and again, by May, there were enough subscribers. So the foundation stone was laid in 1769, And just 1.5 years later, the rooms were completed and ready to open. I think that's astounding, especially considering by the time we get to the 20th century, how long it takes to rebuild the building after the war. But the rooms opened in 1771 with a ridotto, which is a kind of combination of both a concert and a ball. This is the kind of birth of the assembly rooms as we know it. Was that the end of the problems and the challenges? No, it wasn't. So firstly, I just want to talk about the two different designs for the assembly rooms. The one on the left is by Robert and James Adam. And as you can see, it's a very different style from the ones that we got at the moment. And there's two reasons for this. One will be a recurring theme of my talk, which is finance. This was very expensive design by the Adams. And although potentially it could have been funded by Pulteney in the same way that the bridge eventually was, this was just seen as too financially challenging. And a little bit of context to this is that because of the failure of the first subscription that John Wood raised, which got instantly enough investors, the second subscription wasn't as popular, and many people were worried, especially as the kind of building boom in Bath was coming to an end by that point. So they were worried about their kind of financial investment if they invested. So money was a big consideration, and this Adams design was seen as a bit too risky. The second is just about taste. So as you can see, this design is very classical and Palladian. And the building on the left is very in keeping with what we now associate with a lot of Georgian Bath. It's kind of very consistent in its stone color, its kind of general design. And that's actually, we kind of view that as historic buildings, but for the time that was really new and innovative. So remember that the kind of buildings that John Wood, the elder, is building have never been seen before. So the circus is a completely new invention. His kind of engineering of the square and the kind of social politics of architecture, that was all completely new. So looking at these two designs would be a little bit like us trying to build a new civic building and comparing, for example, a Victorian classic design to one that's built of steel and glass. So one has the kind of prestige of looking old and classic, but one looks new and modern and purposeful and future looking. So to us, this looks like an old building, but to them, this was really innovative and new. This was the equivalent of building a big glass building in the middle of in Georgian Bath to us. That's the kind of parallel that I'm drawing. And it was cheaper. So this is the version that we got. So another challenge right from the start, money, finance, and that will kind of dog the assembly rooms for the next 100 years of its history. I think the funnest opening challenge that we often talk about, the kind of best anecdote that we have, is to do with the chandeliers and Thomas Gainesboro, who was obviously the famous society painter. In one of the opening balls, Thomas Gainesboro and his friend John Palmer were standing underneath the chandeliers, and one of the arms of the chandeliers broke off and landed literally right next to his head. This was really quite something because I cannot tell you how heavy even one arm of those chandeliers are. So a kind of flaming meteor plummeting from the sky next to your head is quite an extreme experience. He uses quite extreme language. He says, standing under one of the chandeliers, Palmer notices, he kind of says that they narrowly escaped having our crowns cracked. So that's the equivalent of us saying kind of having our skulls split open. So he kind of uses really explicit language. He's clearly quite harrowed by this event. So this is yet another opening challenge. It meant that we had to redo the chandeliers and kind of rethink about suppliers. So only some of the chandeliers that you see are original to the opening. They're all original to 1771 and 2, but not all of them were present at the opening nights. So that's kind of one fun fact. The oldest components are in the octagon, the Great Octagon, if you're next there and are interested. And the final opening challenge that I want to talk about is what would become a kind of ongoing issue of the relationship with the other assembly rooms in the city. So this is a kind of pictorial representation of the 3 assembly rooms as they were. So as you can see halfway through the screen in 1771, the new assembly rooms open, and that almost immediately closes the terrace walk rooms due to competition. So that was the kind of smallest venue of them. The gravel walk rooms, which was at the time known as Simpson's, very much kind of entered the spirit of competition. And this was really good. And this would develop finally into a really healthy relationship between the two rooms, kind of lots of healthy competition. They would share the social schedule, doing balls on different nights, for example. But that relationship did take a few years to get to that nice, friendly state. And at the first few years, there were a little bit of teething issues. So this initiated what we curators call the Battle of the Ballrooms. In 1771, this really blew up, a huge social issue in the town. One commentator at the time says, "The peace of this city is again highly disturbed. We expect nothing less than a civil war, and that too of the worst kind." And if you want a little bit of a laugh sometime, you can read this work on the left of the screen, it's free on the internet. It's called The Rival Ballrooms. It's published in 1774, and it collects together all the different letters and write-ins to the newspapers of the citizens commenting on this kind of rivalry between the two ballrooms, the lower rooms and the upper rooms. So some of them are anonymous because they're making quite rude claims. Some of them are named, some of them are on the side of the upper rooms, some of them are on the side of the lower rooms. And I cannot tell you how toxic this battle of the ballrooms got. There were mass boycotts of the rooms. Both rooms nearly closed at one point. So this really tore the city apart a little bit. And it really took the proprietors, the committee members of both rooms to really sit down together and figure out how they were going to share the space before this relationship became a lot more cordial and a lot more friendly. So I don't need to introduce the image on the bottom right, which was a kind of early venue for Grillsy. But this is the lower rooms. And actually, you can see there are some kind of architectural similarities between the upper and lower rooms. But I'm glad to say that dispute didn't last very long and that peace did come. But certainly that was another real opening challenge. And the last thing I want to say just in this section of opening challenges is that note back towards John Wood the Elder's vision, because exactly as he wanted this to be, a space where everyone could mix, that's how it became. So I'll just skip one slide and say, people commented at the time again and again how refreshing it was to see different kinds of people mix in the same room. We believe this was the only room in the country where a shopkeeper could attend the same event as a royal. That was really modern. It was really progressive. And many people loved it and commented on its progressiveness. And of course, there were some detractors as well. There were some people who complained about the kind of corruption of upper class society and the kind of way that suddenly Bath society was a lot more mixed than it used to be. So the Bath Guide in 1784 kind of gives this gushing review of the assembly rooms, and it really praises the fact that everyone is mixing equally. But you can see there are also some kind of certain satirical poems and prints which have a little bit more of a kick to them, a little bit of a bite. So this poem notes that distinction of rank in a moment is gone, and all eager for tea in a mass now move on. Mistress O'Darby, the dealer in butter, sweats by the side of the sweet lady Flutter. So this poem relies on the kind of image of a shopkeeper, literally a dairy woman, sitting next to an aristocratic lady. And the aristocratic lady who kind of has her little poodle and has her smelling salts because it's so hot and sweaty, is actually kind of mixing with shopkeepers, dairy women, older men of the city. So sometimes these comments are well-meaning, but sometimes people are complaining about the mixture in society. But the point was that anyone who could afford a ticket could come to the balls, and tickets were very reasonable. So shopkeepers very often did come to the balls. We have notes that servants came to the balls, that hairdressers came to the balls. It was a real mixture of society, and that really distinguished it from the lower rooms, which kind of maintained that exclusivity of its clientele. And the schedule looked a little bit like this. So on Monday, there would be dress or public balls. So these were the formal balls. Wednesdays, there'd be concerts. This is during the season, so October to May. Every week, there'd be dress balls on Monday, concerts on Wednesdays. Thursday would be the cotillon or fancy balls, what we would think of fancy dress. So this is people coming in classically inspired outfits or outfits of animals or seasons or characters from plays every Thursday. And then the assembly rooms were built not just for assemblies, for balls. They had a coffee house, they had a billiards room, they had reading rooms, they had a cold bath. It was a little bit like we would think of a shopping mall. There's shops there, but there might be a cinema, there might be a bowling alley, there might be kind of all these other separate facilities. So it was a really all leisure facility. And if you had a subscription for the season, you could come every day. You could use the reading room or the coffee house or promenade when it was raining outside. So it was a really multi-purpose facility. And outside these kind of weekly events, there were also special events, which included charity concerts, balls and breakfasts, special celebrity events. One of the biggest was our platforming of the Black violinist George Bridgetower, who was 10 years old and made his public debut at the Bath Assembly Rooms. He went on to play alongside Beethoven, who devoted a sonata to him. So it was kind of already championing quite historically excluded kinds of people and kind of making them into celebrities. Twice a year, there were Master of Ceremonies balls, which would kind of directly go into the Master of Ceremonies pockets, which would open and close the season, kind of huge society events. And one of the biggest annual events was Queen Charlotte's birthday ball in May. So Queen Charlotte herself never came to Bath, but Bath was kind of replicating the London balls. And this is the one where they really made an effort. They would kind of bring in whole gardens and kind of build structures in the middle of the ballroom, like Japanese pagodas or big pavilions. They'd have fire breathers and fire eaters, all these kind of dancers. So these are really kind of high-end events, kind of lots of different kind of real spectacular events. These events were expensive, but the point was because everyone could come, this was the place to be, and people came all the way to London just to experience some of these special balls. And because literally thousands of people attended the ball each week, like clockwork, it was kind of the only time really in the building's history where it's made a lot of money. It kind of answered John Wood the Elder's vision, and it was also really financially successful after a few little bumps at the beginning. Okay, so I'll now move on to a series of challenges after the Georgian heyday. And from the period of around 1815 onwards, as you know, the city experienced a kind of new chapter in its history. And partly this was due to the growth of, for example, seaside resorts like Brighton and Lyme Regis, and partly also just the innovations in steam travel, including boats and trains. So actually a lot of people were holidaying both abroad in Europe and elsewhere in the country. So Bath became less unique as a spa resort holiday destination. And the other big change was a kind of slow change in morals. The kind of Georgians were a very different social group to the Victorians, and the Victorians liked things very ordered and prim and proper, and everything had to have its right place. And that meant social distinction. So the kind of John the Wood the Elder's vision of everyone mixing together became increasingly questioned. And although at the beginning, the fact that everyone was mixing equally was praised, when you get to the 1800s and the 1810s, that narrative is changing. And actually more people are complaining about it than they are praising it. This culminates in 1816, when actually the proprietors of the assembly rooms decide to take action, and they literally kind of decree publicly that from that moment on in 1816, no tradespeople can enter the assembly rooms anymore for balls. So this completely changes the tone of the social calendar. And it means that in the old days, when there were thousands of people coming every single week just to attend the balls, the kind of audiences who attend the balls change. Not instantly, but there was a change that did manifest itself. And this was almost the beginning, in addition to the decline of the Georgian heyday and the kind of decline of Bath more generally, of a kind of difficult financial period for the assembly rooms. They still had balls, and as you can see, here is a fancy ball. I believe it's from the 1830s. You can still see people in there kind of fancy dress outfits. So they did still have assemblies, but they changed the format. So instead of having weekly balls, the further on you get into the 19th century, they have balls that are fewer and fewer apart and much more expensive. So instead of having regular, very cheap balls, they have fewer, very expensive balls. And that means, again, the clientele of people attending the assemblies changes very much. They still have celebrity events, and you get top marks if you can recognize everyone on the screen. So we had readings by Charles Dickens. We had performances by Franz Liszt. We had performances by Strauss, the elder. And also we had readings by Oscar Wilde. And these are just a selection, but these kind of very exclusive celebrity events, again, change the tone of the kind of people who are coming through the doors. They also have, this is the image I showed earlier, informal concerts. So you can see here that this is not geared up for a mass performance of hundreds and thousands of people. This is the ballroom. This can fit more than 1,000 people in. But here, the focus is in maybe 100 people who can attend. So a much, much smaller crowd who will pay a higher ticket and have this kind of home style domestic experience where they get kind of personalized service. They can get drinks at their seat. So this is a very different kind of experience, a very different kind of ethos to the original opening of the balls. Did this approach work? Did it bring in the same amount of money as it did previously? It really didn't. The decline really starts to hit and money becomes a real issue for the proprietors of the assembly rooms. And they begin a series of innovations, starting to use the building for a few different purposes than it was originally intended. Some of these, so for example, is letting the basement to a wine merchant. If you've ever seen the basement of the assembly rooms, it's huge. It covers the entire bottom floor of the whole building. This is just one room, the North Cellar. That doesn't exist now, but you can get a sense of the scale. So they have a lot of space to play with. So they're thinking about the ways that they can monetize the space. And some other ways that they try to bring in some extra income to kind of fight this decline, the kind of financial challenges are a warehouse for wine merchants. They leased the ground floor to the Bath Sun Fire Insurance Office and housed the fire engines. They let the rooms to certain conservative and political parties. So the Bath suffrage movement, which was associated with the Bath Conservative Association, had their hub there. It was inaugurated as a Presbyterian church for a really long time in its history. So before the Margaret Chapel was built on Brock Street in 1904, every week they were met in the assembly room. So it was officially consecrated as a Presbyterian church. And it was also used as a hub for trade unions, most notably the Bath Trade Union and the National Union of Railwaymen, but also a few others. But also you can see that although these are quite innovative uses for the assembly rooms, the kind of people that they are letting it to are still very exclusive. So if it's a religious group, that's fine. If it's a political group, that's fine. But this still kind of accords with the kind of Victorian code of respectability. Religion and politics, that's fine, but any kind of light entertainments or anything that could be just construed in a kind of way that might compromise the respectability of the space is not considered. This really kind of culminated in the fact that by the end of the century, they were in very, very deep financial trouble. Partly this is the growth of competition. There are more ballrooms in the city by this time, and most popular were the two ballrooms in the new hotels. So the Pump Room Hotel, which was near the Pump Room and doesn't exist anymore, but also the Empire Hotel. And the Empire Hotel still exists today as kind of apartments and restaurants, as you may know. But the fact is that these two hotels, along with the Pump Room itself, which had recently been expanded, and the Guildhall, meant that there were 4 other ballrooms in the city. And 3 of those 4 had all the upgraded mod cons, they had electricity, they had good heating, and the assembly rooms was a big unwieldy building at the top of town who was very exclusive, and they were facing increased competition to these other venues. And partly the problem was a little bit the size. The fact was that balls just were not as popular anymore. And if you wanted, let's just say, a private ball for your birthday, you could take 50 people very easily to the Guildhall and have a very kind of bustling ball. But if you took 50 people to the assembly rooms, it kind of looks like no one's showed up, you know? So you kind of, it's expensive, it doesn't have electric light, it's cold, it's hard to fill. So it has all these problems, and it's just losing out to these competitors. So a new strategy was decided in which a totally new direction of kind of strategic approach needed to be had. So this included upgraded facilities, including electric light, upgraded and additional toilets, exits and fireproofing, to put them on par with the other ballrooms in the city. That's a lot of money. It's a huge building. It's very, very difficult to work with. And this kind of was almost financed partly by the sale of our most iconic painting, which was Gainesboro's portrait of Captain Wade, which hung in the Octagon. At the time, that sold for 2,200 guineas, which is an exceedingly high amount of money for a painting. Today, that's around £250,000. So that part funded some of the refurbishments. But they also realized, they kind of looked at the track record of attendance in the Georgian heyday and then the 19th century and realized that actually they had to take a more inclusive approach. They had to return a little bit to that vision of John Wood the Elder. And they decided that to get people back into the building, they had to be a bit less choosy about who they could admit into the building. And one of the biggest growing industries at this time was light entertainment. So that includes early examples of traveling exhibitions and spectacles, visual illusions, but also the kind of newly developing talking pictures, moving pictures, and cinematic displays. So the Victorians at one point would have shuddered to think of a cinema in the Bath assembly rooms, but now this kind of really pressing financial challenges almost forces their hand. So the rooms were closed to enact these new refurbishments, and they kind of reopened in 1904 with this new strategic approach. Let's be more inclusive. We just need people back in the building. Did this work? It did and it didn't. It definitely kept the building open in a way that it was really nearly closed here. As you can see, it was actually, there were talks that it would be bought by an unnamed emporium company in London and kind of turned into a big department store. That was kind of the only way that it was kind of deemed it could be really financially viable. So we nearly lost the assembly rooms, not due to bomb damage or kind of anything else, but literally just through a loss of interest, a kind of loss of connection to the real living people of Bath. This is what the refurbishments look like. So this is a picture from 1905. You can see it's very different to the style of both the Georgian and Victorian visions of the ballroom. And if you want to know what it looks like as a cinema space, we have this image from the 20s, and a completely different space, as you can see. But one thing I want to kind of emphasize here, if you compare that image on the screen to that, if you remember that image from earlier of that private concert with maybe 100 chairs in, so the difference in approach between allowing just 100 people in and then literally more than 1,000 like this, you can see there's a total U-turn in approach here. So now the purpose is just to people the building, just to get people to fall in love with the building again. What else did they do to try and build interest in the building? They still pursued a lettings strategy, so letting the building out to interested groups. But the kind of groups that they let the building out to now expanded dramatically. So where previously it was letted to, for example, religious groups or political groups, now it was much, much more creative and kind of a much wider net. So firstly, it was used as a cinema. It was used as a dance school and a centre for dance displays, including, for example, that by Girl Guides. It was used as the hub of the Bath Quartet Society. It was used as a lecture hall. It was used for spiritualist society meetings. Can you imagine what the Victorians would think of that? It was used as a mess hall during the First World War for the 610th Army Service Corps. Again, the Victorians would never think such a grand building could be used for a purpose kind of full of kind of raucous young men, kind of smoking, maybe swearing, drinking. So again, a complete U-turn in the kind of acceptable ideologies of youth here. And perhaps most famously, the building was temporarily used as a factory for airplane parts. So lots and lots of different places around Bristol and Bath were kind of co-opted for the war effort. But the Bath Assembly Rooms were unique in that the ballroom was so big that it was one of the only places where an aircraft wing could be constructed from kind of end to end. So this big space was actually used as a kind of assembly of parts. So not an assembly as in a ball, but an assembly as in a manufacturer. So again, a completely different use. And again, the Victorians would kind of shudder at the kind of thought of the assembly rooms as a factory, but this was what the city needed. So actually now it was a building that was responding to need as opposed to just the kind of prescribed social codes of a few people. My favorite is that the building was used as the hub for the Bath Fanciers Association poultry show, which was a kind of competition for animals which were displayed, show animals. We know that there were more than 1,000 birds in the ballroom, octagon, and tea room. And I always think that I'm so glad that I wasn't involved in cleaning up after that. So a real variety of uses now, not just a very selective, exclusive use, but a complete U-turn in strategy. And this really did work. If not financially, financially it was a lot more stable, but what we do know is that people really connected with the building again in a really kind of heartfelt way. So the building was crowdfunded by that subscription. It was literally built for the people and by the people. It was a building that was supposed to be at the service of the town as opposed to the service of just a few people. So this was really returning it to its original vision. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, the ideological challenges. And I'll just kind of mention the kind of change of ownership in that kind of during this time, 1904 to 1942, there were a few changes of management. It was bought by the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings in 1931, who gifted it to the National Trust. And the National Trust then leased the building to the Bath City Council for a nominal kind of peppercorn rent of £1 per year, provided that the council would maintain responsibility for the building's condition and kind of enact any restorations or repairs that were needed. So this was the agreement that was reached in 1931. And that agreement has been honoured all the way up to today. So even just before the National Trust took back management, we charged the council almost zero rent. And we wanted to honour this original contract in that all the council needed to do was kind of just take responsibility for the repair, and we would keep the building cheap and at the service of the people of Bath. So the building was closed as a cinema in 1934 after this kind of new ownership and kind of purchased by the Society of the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and reopened in 1938 as a community space specifically. So it would stop becoming just monetized for the purpose of cinema displays and kind of would be re-given just for the purpose of the community. And this brings me to the Second World War. And the reason that I think it was really successful in reconnecting to the people of the city is actually this image. This image was produced as a kind of summary of the bombardment of Bath. But there were many different places in Bath that suffered in the Baedeker Blitz of 1942. And it's actually quite emotional to me that the building on the front of this is the Bath Assembly Rooms. And what that suggests to me is that actually by this time, people had reconnected with the building so much that the bombardment of Bath Assembly Rooms was the bombardment of Bath. The Assembly Rooms were now again the symbol of the city. They kind of were so central to the people of the city that the two things went hand in hand, and the kind of bombardment, the attack on the assembly rooms was symbolic of the attack of the Bath people in a kind of wider symbolic sense. So we really suffered during the Baedeker Blitz, and the Baedeker Blitz was a kind of effort by Germany to target not strategic kind of army bases or kind of strategic targets, but actually just to kind of attack British morale by attacking heritage sites. So Bath wasn't the only place that was hit. There are other places, for example, like York and Canterbury, so kind of these heritage sites. But Bath really suffered, and the assembly rooms was directly hit by an incendiary bomb, which went straight through the roof and burnt most of the building to the ground. Sorry, lost my... Okay. These are some of the pictures of the damage. So some of the buildings survived. You can see that the kind of the girders kind of remain, and the strong stone columns remain, but nearly everything else is gone. So the shell, the outer shell of the building, the kind of four walls around the perimeter survived, but nearly everything else we lost. And crucially, this really affected the basement, which was kind of really kind of took the brunt and kind of was absolutely full of rubble. So this was a really complex job to try and think about restoring. But what's really nice, and again, going back to this kind of reconnection of the building to the people of Bath, is that there was instant appetite to rebuild it. So this was hit in April 42. And just 1 month later, we already have proof that people are already demanding to see the rebuilding of the assembly rooms. So this letter says, as a matter of fact, several people have already been asking what it is the Trust's intention to do with the building after the war. So these conversations are happening almost immediately. The building is taken away and the people immediately feel its loss. So again, as a curator, I kind of deduct from that the building had actually returned to a really central place in the city's kind of social scene. Luckily, because of the new of refurbs in 1938, we had quite complete design plans. And another factor was that war damage insurance, the policy was actually, it depended on, it predicated the fact that any reinstallment had to be a kind of complete reconstruction exactly as a building was. And given that we had such complete plans from 1938, these plans kind of took over again as a kind of reconstruction, as the kind of basis for a reconstruction. So although there were some minor amends, basically, the building that we have today in its reconstruction are the same plans as the kind of original Georgian footprint. There are a few key differences. So for example, the billiards rooms and the coffee house, if you can picture the front of the building kind of jutted out either side of the entrance into the forecourt. So you kind of went through into the rooms, kind of flanked either side by these kind of two buildings that kind of jutted out of the main building. So they were lost, but nearly everything else was retained. So the broad footprint of the building as you visit today is the same rough layout as it was when it was built in the 1770s. The completion was also supplemented by the gift of a very large collection of beautiful historic dress and accessories. And the building finally reopened in 1963. So again, I just want to kind of compare the contrast. The building was originally built in 1 year and a half. But this is more than a 20-year gap between 1942 and 1963. So even with all the kind of evolution in building technology and kind of innovations in construction, it took a long time to rebuild, partly just because of, for example, trouble with the rubble and the basement and etc. And that brings me to today. So I'm kind of going to wrap up my talk now. These are some pictures from the original refurbishment. So this is kind of within living memory now. Personally, as just a matter of personal taste, I absolutely detest the floor in the tea room at this time. I think we can do better than that. As you know, this kind of collection then evolved into the Fashion Museum in 1975, kind of had its main house in the basement, but also did kind of periodic displays upstairs as well. That kind of brings us to today and the kind of transfer of ownership to the National Trust from the council, which again is a kind of, I won't kind of include that in my list of challenges, but it kind of presents the National Trust with a kind of list of future considerations and lots of kind of important decisions about kind of bearing in mind all the history that I've just been through, how we can honor that kind of vision of the building and how we can open the doors kind of faithful to its original raison d'etre. So my last slide is about just like a few kind of key facts. So the contract of the management of the building was renewed in 2013. And a kind of conversation happened between the council and the National Trust, and it was agreed that there would be a 10-year renewal of the contract with the possibility of a 5-year break clause, which could potentially happen in 2018. And in 2018, the two parties met again, and both sides agreed that actually it was mutually beneficial for both parties that the National Trust would take back ownership of the building. And partly that was just because the collection of the Fashion Museum had been really carefully curated and evolved over the years. It was a really big collection by this point. So they were displaying about 10% of their whole collection. And as a curator, I can promise you that working with historic dress, it doesn't like being in storage in a dark, humid basement. Just space was an issue. And so both parties agreed that this was the right time, and a kind of transfer of ownership happened, meaning that in March 2023, last year, the National Trust took back direct management of the building. And we're really proud to say that less than a month later, we reopened the building 7 days a week. And we've tried really hard in our kind of initial reopening to get as many people back through the building as we can. We really want to kind of diversify the kind of people who are experiencing the building. We're very aware that we're going to close imminently. We're embarking on a huge project of capital works and construction. And we have two focuses for this, accessibility and sustainability. So first, accessibility. The building is huge. It's an absolute nightmare to kind of navigate. It only has a lift that works between 2 of the floors, and there are 4 floors in total. In terms of, for example, exit strategies and kind of wheelchair access, even things like comfort. I've worked in the assembly rooms in both the kind of deep winter and the high summer. Just in terms of being a comfortable building that everyone is kind of comfortable to experience and be happy staying in, it needs a lot of work. So accessibility is one of our focuses, and sustainability is the other. So these are our kind of two main priorities as we've just got back the building. The building is very big and unwieldy. It's still running on gas. What we want to do is install air source heat pumps, do some good installations of kind of installation of insulation, and just make sure that the building is ecologically sustainable. So those are our two kind of immediate priorities in getting the building up to kind of 21st century standards. And that means work. That means closing the building temporarily while we kind of enact those changes. And with that understanding, we wanted the building to be as open and accessible as possible in this first year, so we can prove that we're really keen to kind of give the building back to people for use. And as you can see, since April 2023, we've welcomed nearly 50,000 people back through the building. That is a huge amount of people, and that kind of rivals the numbers in those first days in the Georgian heyday, so we're really happy about that. The last thing I'll say is just a tiny glimpse into our future plans. What are we going to do with the building once we reopen it? So this is one quick visualization of what the ballroom might look like after we're finished. The plan is to refurb the whole of the basement into a kind of museum-style space, which gives context to Georgian Bath. It will have objects, and we're actually going to present a series of fictional characters who are based on composites of real historical figures who lived in Bath. And that will be really diverse. There'll be, for example, characters inspired by the black violinist that played at the assembly rooms. It will be inspired by the aristocrats that visited the assembly rooms. It will be inspired by the servants who worked downstairs in the assembly rooms. So a real diverse cast of characters based on real historical figures and objects. And then after that kind of context building downstairs in the basement, visitors can come upstairs, and we're trying to bring a Georgian ball to life through modern technology and kind of projections and a few other tricks that we have up our sleeve. So they'll experience a kind of full spread banquet in the tea room, a kind of Georgian special banquet. There'll be kind of Georgian-inspired games in the octagon room, which was historically used for gaming and gambling. And then in the ballroom itself, there'll be kind of projections of what it would like to feel in a fully peopled ball. And one of our focuses here as well is also just to pay real respect to the building as it is. Partly we'll have some of these kind of flashy projections, but a real priority for us is also just having lots of connection with the real building as it is. So moments where the lights turn off and people can really reconnect with the real kind of history of the building and the fabric of the building as it is. I've talked to you for more than 40 minutes, so thank you so much for your patience. And it's been a real pleasure to come and talk to you. I'll leave the floor open for questions. Thank you so much.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. That was terribly informative, and I'm really pleased we were able to persuade you to come and talk to us tonight. It is ironic that the success of your building probably led to the birth of this organization, because the lower assembly rooms burnt down, but nobody wanted to rebuild it. They thought it'd be much better to turn it into a learned institution. And that was the Literary and Scientific Institution of Bath, which got going in 1824. So that's why we're here today. So thank you to the assembly rooms for that. Now, we have questions, I hope, in the room, and my colleague over there will come around with a roving microphone. Could you please speak with the microphone fairly close so that the people online can hear you? And then I'll see if there are any in the chat room and come up with those two.
We'll start here.
You mentioned the management structure up until the 1930s. How was it managed? Because you kept saying they decided to do X, Y, and Z. I'm just wondering who they were.
That's a great question. So it was a committee that was formed of a percentage of those subscribers. So at the beginning, there were about 70 subscribers who invested in the building, and a percentage of those, about kind of between 10 and 15 people, sat on a committee, and they were directly responsible for the kind of management decisions of the assembly rooms. But most importantly, because they had not control over, but because they managed and liaised with the Master of Ceremonies, who set the social calendar for not just the assembly rooms, but the whole of Bath, actually these individuals had a lot of power. So it was them who was deciding how many balls there were each week, who could come, how expensive they were. So actually this small group of people had a huge amount of power and influence over the social calendar of Bath as a city. But great question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Let's seem to get this to work.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting. I understand there's a cold room in the basement.
Yes. Yes, so we do. We have a original cold bath in the basement. It's very unusual, and we're not 100% sure why. There are lots of cold baths in Georgian England, but they're all either, for example, part of an actual bathing centre, like the Roman Baths, which has a cold bath, or they're in private institutions, so like a private house. So this is actually the only example in the country that we know of where a cold bath is in a public building. And again, we kind of think that's tying into that building of this really multi-purpose building where people will come for all different kinds of reasons. But health was a real kind of, the wellness industry was really monetized by the city, and the assembly rooms, I think, just wanted in on some of that. So that's probably why we have it. But yeah, thank you.
Bomb dropped.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
When the bomb dropped in 19...
Yes.
Where were the chandeliers?
That is an excellent question. Thankfully, the curators at the time had the foresight to take them out and conceal them in some nearby mines. So we're really very, very lucky that they did. We also had an offer from the White House, actually, for those chandeliers for a long-term loan and we considered a short term, but we said no to the long term. And again, I'm very grateful that we still have them, but that's how they survived the war. Yeah.
Got questions online, David, or should I one from the room? Or
there is one comment online which is probably more of a statement than a comment, but it said, on the question of historical financial challenges, it's very sad there's been such limited opportunity to assemble for events, i.e. No Bath Festival, etc., in these rooms. I think it means in recent years, in recent times, and not to be able to visit the Fashion Museum, and the revenue loss for both the National Trust and Baines must be quite significant. Why was there no extension for the Fashion Museum to dovetail their new development with what the National Trust is doing? I'm not sure if that's a fair question for you, being a historical
yeah, I think all I'll say to that, it was a very kind of mutual decision that was made. And what I will say is in the new kind of program of works that we're doing, partly we've got a huge amount of money set aside, which has nothing to do with the reconstruction of the building and is only to do with kind of opening the building to the community. So a kind of huge suite of community programming and events. Actually, one of my colleagues is in the room who's kind of done so much work on this. So we're really keen that not only is the building open, but we're kind of partnering with as many different people as possible, getting as many different events and kinds of events in the building, exactly like the Bath Festival, so that we're doing a lot of work on what assembly means in the 21st century and how people want to use the building. We've been doing a lot of listening, a lot of consultation, and just saying, if you could use this building for anything, what would you do? And kind of really trying to kind of learn from that and make these opportunities available. So as a short answer, I would say I can't wait for 2026, because please watch this space. I think you'll be really pleasantly surprised.
I was told a few years ago by an elderly friend who's since died, her father was mayor of Bath in the 1930s, and he was approached by Ernest Cook, who said he was happy to fund the restoration of the assembly rooms on the understanding it would remain a secret, because she told me, I have no reason to believe, you know, that's not true. Do you know how long that was kept a secret? What she actually said was, he said, if it doesn't remain a secret, I will leave Bath, and that'll be the end of all my contributions to the city.
Wow, I haven't heard that actually. I've certainly never encountered any paper evidence of that, but it might be, I mean, if that was true, you might assume that he would kind of destroy any evidence. So I actually can't comment either way on that, apart from I haven't seen any evidence of it myself. And also kind of documentation from that kind of transition in the 30s is quite scarce. We know a little bit, but not everything. So some of the gaps, we do have some gaps in our knowledge for that kind of little process. But yeah, thank you so much. That's a really, I'll have to go away and think about that actually. Have a little dig around, yeah. Hey.
You mentioned that shopkeepers could...
You mentioned that shopkeepers could attend the balls. How much would it have cost to buy a ticket to a ball? And what would that be in today's money?
That is a great question. I normally know the answer, and it's just gone out my head. Is it 5 shillings? That sounds, if Colin says so, then it's almost certainly right. But it was certainly affordable. And we have so many references to, like I said, servants and hairdressers and shopkeepers that we can tell that it must have been accessible to at least a kind of proportion of people like this. The other thing I'll say is the subscribers, the people who invested in the assembly rooms, again, a really diverse group of people. Actually, this is one of the reasons why the Battle of the Ballrooms was so fierce. The subscribers to the lower rooms were almost all kind of aristocratic and members of the gentry, whereas the investors in the upper rooms were, they had one aristocrat, one earl, and the rest, some of them were gentry, but a lot of them were just ordinary working people of Bath. They were doctors and reverends and lawyers, bankers. A lot of them were women. We had over a third of women investors at one point. So a lot of the kind of fierceness of that Battle of the Ballrooms is people who kind of object to what they call, quote unquote, a parcel of shopkeepers who have all this power and who are kind of negotiating the social calendar. So that's one of the reasons why so many people kind of tried to boycott the upper assembly rooms. They just didn't want shopkeepers in charge of the social calendar. Hi.
Hi. What is your capital budget for this project, and when will it complete?
I don't think I'll answer the first one just in case. I don't know if I have clearance. And the second, we're hoping to open in Easter 26. And when I say open, I mean all the capital works finished and the visitor experience ready to go. And we're hoping to have a few different kind of offers in the visitor experience, but mainly the things that are kind of will hit the ground running in 2026 are the kind of reopening of the visitor experience and then the launch, the kind of on-the-ground launch, as it were, of that kind of suite of community events and programming that I mentioned. So those are the kind of two big things, and Easter 26.
Is there another question at the back?
One at the back.
Evening. I've read that people used to walk around the gardens of the assembly rooms, but I don't know whether that was these assembly rooms or the lower ones. But if there were gardens, where were they? Because it's not evident where the space was, or did they just promenade inside generally?
Yep, that's a great question. That would almost certainly be the lower rooms, because the lower rooms were connected to what was called the kind of terrace walks and the gravel walks, which were a kind of section of the city very close to the river. But they were kind of lined by trees, a kind of orange grove. And because the rooms were kind of directly and adjacent, kind of promenading between the two was very common. So this is why the kind of pump room, the orange grove, and the lower rooms were so associated with promenading. Promenading was part of the kind of wellness craze. It was literally just exercising. It was kind of it was thought that the benefits of bathing were not complete if you didn't exercise by walking. But then Bath society being as it is, they kind of turned this into a kind of social competition. So you didn't just walk, you had to look amazing in the latest fashion while you did. You had to be seen to be talking with the right people, that kind of thing. So promenading was popular in the lower rooms and the upper rooms. Yeah, and normally happened inside when it was raining, because remember the Bath season is October to May, so it's kind of midwinter. So promenading inside was very popular. But yeah, so almost certainly the lower rooms for that.
A couple of questions online here.
Please.
One is that your recent series on Georgian fancy balls mentioned that they were also used for dancing schools and dancing masters to put on displays. So to post-1904 activities were in that tradition. And could they be a future activity at the assembly rooms?
I very much hope so. Yep. So we're kind of making space for exactly events of that kind. And we've had a really surprising variety of events in already. Kind of one thing that I kind of found really interesting and exciting was a kind of boxing event. We've had some kind of fashion catwalks. We've had some kind of modern Vogue balls. So we're really keen that the space can be given up to as many different kinds of use as possible. And our kind of one principle is about, it goes back to accessibility. So I kind of, we're trying to kind of have the idea that the rooms used to be open to anyone. Anyone could buy a ticket. And so we're steering away from the approach of kind of more private events, like private parties, because we want the line that if there's an event in the rooms, we want anyone to be able to come in. So inclusivity and accessibility is kind of the word of the day for us. We really want anyone to feel that if there's an event inside the building, they are welcome to apply for a ticket. So that's the kind of approach we're taking with the kind of future thinking of using the building.
Can I just picking up on that?
Yeah.
Does that mean that private events would be excluded completely, or simply that priority would be given to public events?
Not at all. We're kind of keeping all options open on the table. It's just that the kind of preference would be events that, but kind of everything's on the table at the moment. We're still kind of thinking about how best to use the building, and most important is just listening. So we're doing so much consultation. It has been raised in some consultation. So if we consistently hear that as the primary need of the building, then of course we'll make that available. But at the moment, people are much more keen for the kind of events that we're doing. And so at the moment, it's a kind of direct response to what we're hearing. But that kind of period of consultation will kind of remain live. And we're really open to challenge as well. So we're kind of putting out that we are really interested in what people would like. So like I said, kind of one of the kind of foremost questions we're asking is, if you could use this building for anything, kind of what would it be? Kind of challenge us, kind of see what we can do. Because in 26, we'll have a really purpose-built, ready-to-go building. It will have all the mod cons. It will be so accessible. It's such a kind of theatre of opportunity, and we're really keen to use that for all it's worth.
There's one more online here, and I'm quoting. So when I say I'm a mayor of Bath's guide, that's not me online. As we can no longer go inside with our visitors, can we have some big pictures outside? Before the NT took over, we had some pictures of the assembly rooms outside for the visitors to look at. So
great, that's a really good request. Have we noted that? Amazing. Duly noted. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, look, if there's nothing left in the room, I'd just like to express my extreme pleasure at this talk. It's given me so much information, and the connection with the history of this institution is wonderful, even though it wasn't in this particular building. The pictures above you were in the old assembly rooms when they were reconstructed. Tim, we're very grateful for your talk and for you coming on such a hot evening. And thank you very much indeed.
You're so welcome. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.